The clatter of glasses echoed through the opulent bar, but all eyes were on Lysandra Vox, a wealthy heiress with an ego as large as her diamond-studded necklace. She leaned back against the polished counter, her manicured fingers drumming an impatient rhythm. "Play the violin," she ordered coldly, glaring at the bartender, Ethan Darius. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening as murmurs rippled through the crowd of elites. "Ma'am, I'm here to serve drinks, not entertain," he said evenly. Lysandra's laughter was sharp, slicing through the tense atmosphere. "Do it, unless you're too afraid to show us your talent." Her entourage chuckled, fueling the mockery. Ethan's knuckles whitened around the rag he was holding, his pride screaming for him to walk away. But then he saw the violin she had sent her driver to fetch, perched on the counter like a challenge. His eyes darkened as he reached for it. "Fine," he said quietly, lifting the bow. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As the first haunting note rang out, a stunned silence swept over the room. The melody was rich and raw, carrying a sorrow so profound it seemed to stop time. Lysandra's smug grin faltered, her head tilted as if trying to place a memory she didn't know she had. Her chest tightened. That tune, where have I heard it before? Lysandra Vox's laughter echoed through the marble halls of her penthouse that evening, but it carried an unusual edge. She was restless, her mind replaying the haunting melody the bartender had played at the gala. She swirled the crystal glass of wine in her hand, her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows seeming more pensive than poised. The melody lingered in her thoughts, clawing at the edges of her memory. It was more than music. It felt like a fragment of something she had lost, something she couldn't name. The notes tugged at her soul like conjuring images that felt both familiar and distant, a crackling fire, a woman's gentle hum, and a child's laughter fading into the night. That night, Lysandra dreamed of a little boy with dark, curious eyes sitting on a patch of grass, a violin balanced awkwardly in his tiny hands. The scene was vivid, yet blurred at the edges, like a watercolor left out in the rain. She couldn't see the boy's face clearly, but his presence filled her with a strange ache. Startled awake, Lysandra pressed her hand against her chest, her heart pounding. She tried to shake off the sensation, but the fragments of the dream clung to her like cobwebs. Something about that tune had opened a door she wasn't ready to walk through, a door she hadn't even known existed. Unable to sleep, she went to her study and opened an old wooden chest that had belonged to her late mother. Inside were faded photographs and trinkets, but none provided clarity. One photo of herself as a toddler stood out. She was holding hands with another child. His face was partially torn from the picture, leaving only a shadow of his presence behind. "Who are you?" she whispered to the darkness. Lysandra Vox's life was a dazzling mosaic of luxury and privilege, yet beneath its glittering surface lay cracks she refused to acknowledge. The daughter of billionaire mogul Victor Vaux, she was the epitome of high society, polished, poised, and untouchable. Her days were filled with exclusive brunches and boardroom meetings where her word was law, and her nights were an endless parade of champagne-soaked galas. But in the rare quiet moments, when the world wasn't watching, Lysandra felt the hollow weight of her existence. She lived in a sprawling penthouse adorned with art pieces worth more than most people's homes, yet it felt cold, more a museum than a sanctuary. Her relationship with her father was a cornerstone of her dissatisfaction. Victor Vaux was a man of steel, calculating, distant, and unyielding. Lysandra had spent her life trying to earn his approval, stepping into the role of the perfect daughter and businesswoman. Yet, no matter how many deals she closed or charities she supported, Victor's praise was always faint and fleeting. The memories of her mother, Margot, were another source of pain. Margot had been the opposite of Victor, warm, kind, and full of life. But her death in a tragic accident when Lysandra was just 6 years old left a void that no amount of wealth could fill. Victor rarely spoke of Margot, and questions about their family's past were met with curt dismissals or icy silence. That night, after her encounter with Ethan, Lysandra found herself gazing at an old family portrait hanging in her study. Margot's soft smile radiated warmth, but something about the image felt incomplete. There was a faint unease in the photograph, as though someone or something was missing. Lysandra clenched her fists. Who were we before the money? she wondered. Ethan Darius wiped the counter of the upscale bar for what felt like the 100th time that night. The chatter of wealthy patrons, their laughter too loud and their demands too sharp, filled the room. To them, he was invisible, a servant in a crisp white shirt and black tie, existing only to fulfill their whims. But Ethan had long since learned how to tune out their condescension, his focus on the life he wanted beyond these walls. Ethan's life had been anything but easy. Orphaned after a car accident he barely survived, he had no memory of his parents or the family he'd lost. Shuffled through the foster care system, he grew up in a blur of temporary homes and unkept promises. By the time he aged out, Ethan had developed a quiet resilience, determined to carve out a future for himself despite the odds. Music had always been his refuge. A battered violin, a gift from a kind social worker, became his sanctuary. He practiced in parks, subways, and anywhere else he could find a moment of solitude. Playing was more than a skill. It was a lifeline to a part of himself he couldn't quite remember. But life had a way of pulling him back to reality. Rent didn't pay itself, and dreams didn't buy groceries. Bartending at the upscale lounge was supposed to be a temporary gig, but months turned into years. The violin gathered dust in the small apartment he shared with a creaky heater and flickering lights. Still, Ethan couldn't let go of his dream. Each night, as he walked home past the glowing windows of concert halls, he promised himself that someday he wouldn't just be looking in. He would be center stage, playing for an audience that finally saw him. Lysandra's curiosity about the dream and the haunting melody grew into an obsession. She couldn't shake the feeling that the music wasn't just beautiful, it was familiar. For days after the gala, she found herself humming the tune absent-mindedly, the notes filling the emptiness of her penthouse. One morning, she sat at her vanity, scrolling through social media, when a local magazine cover caught her eye. It featured a profile on the gala with a photograph of her surrounded by her usual entourage. But what grabbed her attention wasn't her polished image, it was the blurry figure of the bartender in the background, violin in hand. It took her a moment to place him. He was the man she had mocked, the one she had forced to play for her amusement. She remembered his reluctant posture as she shoved the violin toward him, expecting clumsy notes, but hearing instead a masterpiece that silenced the room. Something about him nagged at her. His face, his movements, they stirred a feeling she couldn't name. Against her better judgment, she picked up the phone and called the event coordinator. After some persuasion and an implied donation to charity, she had the bartender's name, Ethan Darius. She couldn't explain why she needed to know more. Maybe it was guilt, though she rarely felt remorse for her actions. Or maybe it was the nagging sense that this Ethan held a piece of a puzzle she didn't realize she was trying to solve. Lysandra's assistant, Sarah, entered the room, breaking her reverie. "Miss Vaux, your schedule today is packed. Shall I clear anything?" Lysandra shook her head, her mind already made up. "Not today, Sarah. I have somewhere important to be." For the first time in years, Lysandra Vaux decided to go looking for answers herself. The bar was quieter during the day, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and softening the sharp edges of the sleek decor. Ethan Darius was cleaning glasses behind the counter when the door opened. He glanced up, expecting a delivery or perhaps a stray customer, but instead, he saw her, the woman from the gala. Lysandra Vaux walked in like she owned the place, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. Ethan stiffened, his grip tightening on the glass. She approached the counter, her gaze unwavering. "You're Ethan, aren't you?" she asked, her tone less commanding than he remembered, but still edged with authority. "I am," Ethan replied cautiously. "What can I do for you, Miss Vaux?" Her eyes darted to the violin case propped against the wall. "That melody you played at the gala, where did you learn it?" Ethan hesitated. It wasn't a question he'd expected. "I've known it for as long as I can remember. I used to hum it as a kid. Why?" Lysandra's heart skipped a beat. "I've heard it before. In my dreams, in my memories." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ethan frowned, studying her face. There was something familiar about her, a shadow of recognition he couldn't place. Lysandra continued, her voice softer now. "I had this dream, a boy with a violin. It felt so real, and when you played, it was like I was back there. Do you remember anything about your childhood?" Ethan shook his head. "Not much. I grew up in foster care. I don't even know who my parents were. A sharp gasp escaped Lysandra's lips, her hand flying to her mouth. Foster care? She whispered. Ethan, I think we need to talk. The fragile threads of their past were beginning to weave together. The moment the words left Lysandra's lips, the world around them seemed to pause. Ethan looked at her, disbelief flickering across his face. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice low but edged with confusion. He stepped back, his mind racing as the weight of her words sank in. Lysandra took a deep breath, her mind a swirl of emotions. There was a storm brewing inside her, anger, confusion, but also a deep ache, a sense of something lost. I don't know how to explain this, but something about you feels familiar, she said, struggling to steady her voice. I've been looking for answers, and I think you're a part of them, my past, my family. Ethan's gaze hardened, a defensive edge creeping into his features. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested, he replied, turning away slightly. He had enough of rich people making his life harder. But Lysandra wasn't backing down. She reached out, placing a hand on the counter between them, her eyes pleading. Ethan, please. I know this sounds crazy, but my mother had a son before she died, a boy who disappeared when I was very young. He was taken from us, and we were told he died. But I don't believe that anymore. I think it was all a lie, I think. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with tension. His heart raced as memories he thought he had buried long ago began to resurface. Memories of a woman with dark hair and a soft voice, of a home that felt like a dream, then shattered in an instant. No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This isn't possible. Lysandra's eyes met his, raw with emotion. Ethan, you don't have to believe me, but I think you're my brother. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. His world tilted, and for a moment everything he knew seemed to unravel. The silence between them felt like an eternity, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up the violin, the only constant in his fragmented life. He cradled it like a lifeline, unsure of what to say or believe. Lysandra broke the silence first, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. Play it again, she said, nodding toward the violin. The song from the gala. I need to hear it. Ethan hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He didn't trust her, not yet, but something in her tone was different, less arrogant, more desperate. Slowly, he raised the violin to his chin, drawing the bow across the strings. The first note pierced the air, haunting and pure. As the melody unfolded, Lysandra closed her eyes. The music carried her back to a childhood she had long buried. She was 5 years old, sitting in a sunlit garden. A boy sat across from her, his tiny hands awkwardly holding a violin too large for his frame. He played the same melody, a lullaby their mother used to hum when she tucked them into bed. Tears welled up in her eyes. I know this song, she whispered. Ethan's playing faltered, and he looked at her, startled. You do? She nodded, her voice trembling. Our mother used to hum it. I had forgotten until now. It was her favorite. Ethan's breath hitched. The song was his earliest memory, a faint thread connecting him to a life he could barely recall. Hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that shook him to his core. For the first time, Ethan dared to hope that Lysandra might be telling the truth. The melody, once a fragment of his past, was now a bridge to something he thought he'd lost forever. The revelation of the melody left Ethan and Lysandra shaken, but it also ignited a fire in both of them to uncover the truth. Ethan reluctantly agreed to accompany Lysandra back to her penthouse, where she promised to share everything she knew. As the elevator ascended to the top floor, the tension between them was palpable. Lysandra poured herself a glass of wine and gestured for Ethan to sit. There's something you need to know, she began, her voice tight with emotion. After my mother died, my father became different, colder. I always thought it was grief, but now I think he was hiding something. Ethan leaned forward, his arms resting on his knees. And Frau, what does that have to do with me? She hesitated, then pulled out a faded photograph from a leather-bound journal. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a little boy holding a tiny violin. This is my mother, Lysandra said. And this boy, this was my brother, you. Ethan stared at the photograph, his throat tightening. That's impossible, he murmured, but the image stirred something deep within him, a flicker of recognition he couldn't ignore. My father told me you died in an accident, Lysandra continued, her voice trembling. But I overheard a conversation years later. He was arguing with someone, saying, "The boy is gone. No one will find him." I didn't understand it then, but now it makes sense. He didn't lose you, Ethan. He gave you away. The room fell silent as Ethan processed her words. His fists clenched, his mind racing with anger and confusion. Why would he do that? I don't know, Lysandra admitted, tears streaming down her face. But I think it's time we find out. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then let's confront him. The drive to Lysandra's family estate was tense, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure what scared him more, discovering the truth or the possibility that Lysandra might be wrong. When they arrived, the grand estate loomed before them, its towering gates an imposing reminder of the world Lysandra had grown up in and the one Ethan had been denied. As they stepped inside, the staff greeted Lysandra with polite nods, their gazes lingering on Ethan with curiosity. Lysandra led him to the drawing room, where her father, Arthur Vaux, sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in hand. He looked up, his expression hardening as he saw the stranger beside his daughter. "Who is this?" he demanded. Ethan clenched his fists, but Lysandra stepped forward. "Father, we need to talk. It's about Ethan. About the brother you told me died." Arthur's face paled, the scotch glass trembling in his hand. "What nonsense are you talking about?" he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "It's not nonsense," Lysandra said firmly, holding up the photograph. "I found this, and I found him. You lied to me. To both of us." Arthur's eyes darted to Ethan, his composure cracking. "You don't understand," he muttered. Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "Then make us understand," he said, his tone sharp. "Why did you abandon me?" Arthur sank into his chair, the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered, his voice breaking. For the first time in years, the Vaux family sat together, not as strangers, but as fractured pieces of a story waiting to be pieced back together. The tension in the room was suffocating as Arthur Vaugh's confession hung in the air. Ethan's jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on the man who had robbed him of a family. Lysandra, too, was barely holding back tears, her carefully curated world unraveling with every word. "I need proof," Ethan finally said, his voice steady but cold. "Words aren't enough. If I'm really your son, we're doing a DNA test." Arthur nodded reluctantly, his hands trembling. "I'll call the family doctor," he said, his voice hollow. Hours later, a team arrived with the necessary equipment. The procedure was straightforward, simple cheek swabs from Ethan, Lysandra, and Arthur. The samples were sealed, and the doctor assured them that the results would be expedited. The waiting was unbearable. Lysandra paced the room, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Ethan sat silently by the window, staring out at the sprawling gardens, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, hope, and doubt. Arthur remained in his chair, staring into his untouched glass of scotch, his face a mask of regret. "You always knew, didn't you?" Ethan finally asked, breaking the silence. Arthur looked up, his eyes glassy. "I knew," he admitted. "I thought I was protecting you, but now I see it was cowardice. I couldn't face the consequences of my actions." Ethan scoffed, bitterness lacing his words. "You didn't protect me. You abandoned me." Lysandra placed a tentative hand on Ethan's arm. "We'll know the truth soon," she said softly. The next morning, the doctor returned with the results. He handed the sealed envelope to Ethan, who hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. His hands trembled as he scanned the paper, his breath catching in his throat. "It's true," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your son." The room fell silent after Ethan's revelation. The words, "I'm your son," echoed in everyone's minds, each grappling with the weight of the truth. Arthur Vaux's shoulders slumped, years of guilt and denial etched into his face. Lysandra took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between her father and her newly discovered brother. Arthur broke the silence, his voice trembling. "Ethan, I know an apology can't undo the past, but I am so sorry for everything. For what I did to you, to your mother, to all of us." Ethan stood stiffly, his emotions warring inside him. "Sorry doesn't give me back the life I lost," he said, his tone sharp but laced with pain. "You had decades to find me. Why now?" Arthur's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then. I believed. I was scared. But now, seeing you, hearing you play that song, I realize I was wrong. I was a coward. Lysandra stepped forward, her voice steady but emotional. Ethan, I didn't know about you until recently, but I want to make this right. You're my brother, and I want us to start over. Ethan looked at her, his defenses softening. Her sincerity was undeniable, and for the first time, he saw her not as a spoiled heiress, but as someone who genuinely cared. This isn't going to be easy, Ethan said, his voice quieter, but I'm willing to try, for her memory, for the mother I barely remember. Over the next few weeks, the Vox family began the slow process of rebuilding. Arthur sought therapy to confront his mistakes, while Lysandra and Ethan spent time together discovering shared interests and learning to trust one another. For Ethan, forgiveness wasn't instant, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a home. Months passed, and the fractured pieces of the Vox family began to mend. Ethan still carried the weight of his past, but with each shared dinner and heartfelt conversation, the walls he had built around himself slowly crumbled. Lysandra had transformed, shedding her arrogant facade for a more genuine kindness. Even Arthur, once an unyielding figure of pride and secrecy, softened as he sought to make amends for his actions. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, Arthur hesitated before sliding a manila envelope across to Ethan. "This is for you," he said, his voice tinged with hope and trepidation. Ethan opened it to find a legal document, a transfer of ownership for a small music conservatory. "I bought this years ago, but never had the time to invest in it," Arthur explained. "I want you to have it. A place to teach, to inspire others with your music." Ethan was speechless. He looked up at his father, seeing the earnestness in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words heavy with emotion. But fate had one more surprise in store. That same night, as Ethan played his violin in the conservatory's grand hall for the first time, a stranger approached. An elderly woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes watched him intently before speaking. "That melody," she said softly, her voice quivering. "I wrote it years ago for a boy I lost, my grandson." Ethan's heart raced. "What did you say?" The woman's hand trembled as she held out an old photograph, one Ethan instantly recognized. It was the same boy holding the violin. Him. It turned out the Vox family's secrets stretched deeper than anyone imagined. And another chapter of their story was only just beginning. If you're as intrigued as we are, don't forget to like this video to show your support for Ethan's story. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapter filled with shocking revelations and emotional moments. And here's the best part. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below if you're excited for part 2 and share your thoughts on what you think will happen next. Your guesses and ideas might just inspire the continuation of this unforgettable tale. Stay tuned for more because this is just the beginning. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.